In this third endocrine system video, we will primarily focus on the endocrine functions of the pancreas. The pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine functions. In its exocrine functions, the pancreas secretes digestive enzymes that travel down the pancreatic duct into the duodenum of the small intestine, where these enzymes help break down carbohydrates, fats, and proteins from our diet. Here we will focus on the endocrine functions of the pancreas, and these activities occur in the pancreatic islets, where you can find the alpha cells that secrete glucagon, the beta cells that secrete insulin, and the delta cells that secrete somatostatin. When glucose enters the blood, it is taken up by the liver and primarily converted into glycogen for storage. Excess glucose is converted into triglycerides, where it is stored in adipose tissue. We can also store glycogen in our skeletal muscle. When our glucose falls below normal levels, the liver can then break down this glycogen in a process called glycogenolysis. It can also use amino acids to create new glucose, and this is called gluconeogenesis. When more energy is needed, triglycerides can be broken down in a process called lipolysis. Glucagon is secreted in response to low blood glucose levels. We call this hypoglycemia. Remember that normal blood glucose is around 90 milligrams per deciliter. So when that blood glucose drops lower, usually lower than 70 milligrams per deciliter, glucagon will be released. This helps us maintain our blood glucose in normal levels between meals or times of fasting, such as sleeping. Glucagon has several effects. One, it inhibits the uptake of glucose by cells. Two, it promotes the breakdown of glycogen into glucose through the process of glycogenolysis. Three, it promotes the production of glucose from amino acids, the process of gluconeogenesis. And four, it can promote the breakdown of stored triglycerides if needed, releasing free fatty acids and glycerol in the process of lipolysis. Once blood glucose concentrations have returned to normal, this process turns off in a negative feedback pathway. Insulin is secreted in response to elevated blood glucose levels, or hyperglycemia. Insulin's primary function is to lower blood glucose levels. The secretion of insulin has several effects. One, it promotes glucose uptake by target cells, and it also promotes glucose storage as glycogen or as fat. Two, it prevents fat and glycogen breakdown. Thus, it inhibits the processes of lipolysis, or fat breakdown, and glycogenolysis, or glycogen breakdown. Insulin also inhibits the process of gluconeogenesis, where the liver makes new glucose from protein, but it promotes the process of protein synthesis. For most cells in the body, insulin is required for the uptake of glucose. There are several cells that do not require insulin to uptake glucose, and this includes the brain cells, cells of the liver, the kidneys, and the cells that line the small intestine. Insulin is regulated by negative feedback. When there's an increase in blood glucose after a meal, insulin will be released. There's a sharp spike in insulin that quickly functions to start getting that blood glucose back down to the homeostatic levels. There's then a more controlled release over time, slowly bringing that blood glucose down back to normal. Insulin has a short half-life. It only lasts 5 to 10 minutes. When the blood glucose returns to normal, in a negative feedback fashion, this turns off insulin secretion. and this slowly declines and returns to baseline around 2 to 3 hours after eating. Insulin functions to bring glucose transporters to the surface. The binding of insulin to insulin receptors activates an intracellular signaling pathway that then recruits glucose transporters to the cell membrane. Glucose cannot enter the cell membrane without this glucose transporter, except for in those cells that are exceptions, such as the brain, the liver, and the kidneys. Glucose transporters allow the movement of glucose across the cell membrane through facilitated diffusion. The binding of insulin to the insulin receptor also promotes protein synthesis, and thus an amino acid transporter is also brought to the surface, allowing amino acids to enter the cell. So in addition to its glucose regulation function, insulin also promotes growth through several mechanisms that regulate fat synthesis, protein synthesis, growth, and gene expression. Another function of insulin is to move potassium into the cells. Insulin does this by activating the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. Remember, this pump requires energy. But the actions of insulin help activate this pump that drives potassium from the extracellular into the intracellular space and returns sodium from the intracellular back to that extracellular space, again promoting homeostasis. The delta cells of the pancreas secrete somatostatin. Somatostatin is a busy hormone as it has several different functions. In the pancreas, somatostatin inhibits the release of both insulin and glucagon, shutting off that entire process. In the GI system, somatostatin shuts down gastric processes, including gastric secretion, GI motility, and the secretion of GI hormones. And then finally, somatostatin can signal the hypothalamus to inhibit the secretion of growth hormone and to inhibit thyroid-stimulating hormone. So those are 3 different areas where somatostatin shuts things down. And then finally, let's end with a big picture look at organs that have secondary endocrine functions. As you can see, there are a number of organs that have endocrine functions. Pay special attention to organs such as the kidneys that have a number of functions, including the regulation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, regulation of calcium absorption, and regulation of the formation of red blood cells in our bone marrow. In addition to the filtration and glucose regulation functions of the liver, it also helps stimulate body growth through the production of insulin-like growth factor 1. It helps regulate blood pressure through the production of angiotensinogen, a key protein in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. It helps regulate platelets by the production of thrombopoietin. This is an overview of pancreatic function and then a quick glimpse at some of the other endocrine functions of organs.